Thank you, Alan, and I appreciate every time I hear Alan because it makes me feel like, wow, you know, who did we bring you this? We found the best in the country that know this information. So if you guys have things to say, please do. I just thought I'd try to fill in some of the gaps. Since I'm sitting next to Phil and that you've lived in the community, one of those things you Ellen mentioned the grassroots. Meaning it's also like people from Truckee or the area. So we want to know what have they done in the past and what are their feelings about if something like this happened?
Well, the Truckee community was newly incorporated into a city in the 1990s, and Truckee has now become Lake Tahoe North because Lake Tahoe has priced itself out of affordability for a lot of people. And Truckee is not technically in the Tahoe Basin, but it's 10 minutes away. So it markets itself as Lake Tahoe North. And it has changed in the time that I've lived in that area from a lumbering and commodity company community to a very tourism-oriented community. So their Chamber of Commerce and numerous historic groups such as the Tahoe Donner Historic Society and the Donner Summit Historical Society go over a lot of things, and in fact in June there is a thing called the Margie Howell Historic Hike. Margie was the first director of the Donner Summit Historical Society. In the fall and on Labor Day weekend they have for many years done what they call Donner Party Hike Weekend, where there's hikes in all directions at many different lengths of Donner Pass, Coldstream and Roller Pass, which are just south of it, and a whole lot of educational things. The issue that I have with some of those things is that they're more interested in telling a good story than being factual or accurate. But that's common in tourism. Tourism is about leaving, you know, bucks in the stores and heads on beds and things like that. But there is the enthusiasm there, and so if we can demonstrate that the activities that we do benefit the business community up there, all the better. Now, as for Donner, the businesses at Donner Pass area in particular, which are some small stores, Sugar Bowl ski area, Soda Springs ski area, Clifton Lodge, some outfitter guides, some snow removal services, some real estate components. They are very fractured. They can't really, they haven't had some sort of unifying leadership to let them all agree on a course of action to go on it. Some are very pro-development in terms of slicking off the land and building home sites, and some of them are leave me alone, and some of them are preservation related. They need a little bit more, perhaps nurturing and understanding that a rising tide lifts all boats, I think. When I lived up there, I was the neutral observer because I worked for a very political agency and I didn't want to get aligned with one group over the other. And it was fascinating just to listen to different sides and nod and never respond. But again, I think if there's some unifying nature, and perhaps a historic designation, a statement of common purpose would lead everybody in that same direction. I think there's really actually great opportunities. And again, I think that with the new freedoms in legislation that state parks has and the connection with the intellectual resources that they possess, I think there's some really amazing partnership opportunities in the area. One other thing too, and I think you had mentioned earlier, is really playing up to the railroad is very important. I have found on the internet, and I couldn't find it again, I found this years ago, that at some point some group had proposed National Historic Trail designation for the abandoned portions of the original line, and that Union Pacific, or perhaps Southern Pacific at the time, utterly hated that idea because they wrongly felt that it would impede their ability to do their jobs. And a national designation does not obviate any landowner's rights. It just doesn't, but that's not commonly known. It has to be explained. In Union Pacific's case, I believe that they would absolutely insist on continuing to have a right-of-way on the old roadbed for their trucks. They use it to access a certain part of the track. And so I think that if you keep that in mind, and if you help them understand that nothing would preclude that absolute need, I think you'd be a lot more successful with them.
Okay, I'm gonna try another question. And I brought it up to Alan ahead of time because there's actually, as of, I think it was last fall, 2008, because of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Golden Spike Act or so, there's legislation that there are areas along this whole stretch that could be qualified for funding, either through the National Park Service or other agencies, as long as the railroad is not running. And there'd be a question whether or not a truck occasionally showing up is actually keeping it from being, included in the program. But does either of you know about these opportunities for the Golden State Act, or I don't know if you know anything about this? So just saying that there are things in the works related to the Transcontinental Railroad Anniversary that might also be explored.
5771.
Yes. So do you want to make a small comment about that?
Yeah, maybe a comment about overall legislation, which is that the conversations like this that might start with the railroad company, it's in the 20 years I've been doing this, we rarely get an enthusiastic yes at the first conversation. And so I think what you're looking to do is to develop a way to develop a partnership with people in the railroad company so that they understand you're not asking them for everything, but you're inviting them to have an opportunity to support historic preservation in a time where most federal land management agencies and most companies are desperate for ways to connect to more diverse and inclusive audiences. And they want to do that for the politics, they want to do it for the economics, and they want to do it just to be on the right side of history. So now is a really opportune moment to kind of make an approach like that. But what I can tell you about legislation and working with Congress is that there are very innovative and clever ways to draft boundaries for parks and national monuments. There are very clever ways to create heritage areas. There are very, very clever ways to create language within bills that allow people to opt in. But maybe before we get to the legislative thing, it goes back to the grassroots thing that you were talking about, which is the ability to sit in conversation with people and nod. It's an incredibly important tool and tactic for grassroots organizing and being able to conduct outreach to communities. And the one way that things tend to fail at the federal preservation level is to waltz into a community with a big poster about what you're going to do for them without having gotten sufficient input about what people are interested in. And so we do surges with our military all the time. We've done them in Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the things that this community of activists and interested parties can do is to figure out how to do a surge in that community, in Truckee and in the other places out there, to plant and be in the community for a while, hear from them, do community outreach forums and charrettes, things that Forest Service and Park Service folks are past experts at doing, and learn. And so it is repeating this process here with people that we might describe as the non-traditional constituents or the non-aware, non-users and non-supporters who could be enthusiastic supporters of this if only we gave them time and opportunity. But so that's kind of about the legislation, but it's also about how you seed the ground before you get to introduction of a bill.
That was really helpful. Something that I want to mention about National Historic Landmark Designation is we do not move forward with a nomination if the owners are not comfortable with it. So there would be no nomination going forward if the railroad is not on board, which is another reason that the earlier that they're at this table and that they're convinced that this is something that's a win for them, it's a win-win all around. It's better, success is better guaranteed, and it's certainly the only way the National Historic Landmark Designation would go forward. Another thing that I would like to say about National Register listing is that would be a segue for the site to become part of the travel itineraries of the National Park Service and part of teaching with historic places. I recently learned that Teaching with Historic Places, that's one of our websites, is the third most consulted website of Park Service sites. You may have different information. I haven't, this is nothing I tabulate, but I heard this in a presentation. But it was after Yosemite and Yellowstone are the most consulted sites. But think about it, all the teachers in America may be exposing their children to some of America's greatest sites. And let's get this site in that too. So when something becomes a National Historic Landmark, it's also listed in the National Register. So these programs work together in that sense. The other thing I think what's been said about Truckee by both of you and getting that town energized about what's going on is maybe it's a certified local government. If it is, if it's a CLG, then maybe it's a Main Street community. These are, and this is just preservation jargon, but these are designations that communities have that inspire them to celebrate the history and the historic sites within that community and within its broader area. And Truckee would certainly be a springboard for the Summit Tunnel and the other railroad associated sites. So the National Trust invited me and others to participate in an AAPI session meeting last fall. The NAPC, National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, is enthusiastic about an AAPI session at their meeting next summer, which will be in Tacoma, and since that would be a great place to showcase these sites as well. And so I think energizing every level of government is important, and we really should work with local communities that could be supporters and beneficiaries of designations and visitors.